When we think about colonial rule, our minds usually jump to armies, right? To big battles. But what if I told you that some of the biggest changes, the ones that reshaped the entire Indian countryside, came from just a couple of new laws? That's what we're digging into today. How a stroke of a pen could turn a landlord into a king and a farmer into, well, a pop.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did two new laws manage to completely flip the script? How did they transform landlords into something like kings and turn farmers, people who had worked that same land for generations, into serfs? It's a wild story, so let's get right into it and see how it all went down. Okay, so before we can really get the massive scale of this change, we have to rewind a bit. We need to look at how things worked before the British really took over. We're talking about the Mughal land system, which was, a pretty delicate balancing act.
All right, so the main character in this system, the person you really need to know about, is the zemindar. Now, here's the crucial part. In the Mughal era, a zemindar was not the landowner. Think of them more like a powerful middleman. Their job was to collect taxes from the peasants on behalf of the emperor, and for that, they got to keep a.
So you see the difference here, right? Under the Mughals, the zamindar is basically a tax collector. But then the British come in with their permanent settlement, and bam, the role just completely transforms. Suddenly, they're the de facto landowners. They've got the power to set rent, to kick people off the land, everything. Their power isn't coming from the emperor anymore. It's coming straight from a new British legal system, one built to make money for the company. So you gotta ask, why? Why make such a huge, drastic change? Well, it all boiled down to one thing: the East India Company's biggest headache. They needed more money. And that need for cash is what gave birth to Britain's permanent settlement.
Yep, it was really that simple. Money. The company's goal was crystal clear: get as much money from the land as they possibly could. They needed a reliable, predictable stream of cash to pay for their trading operations and, let's be honest, their endless wars. So, in 1793, they come up with what they think is a brilliant solution: the permanent settlement. And the name says it all, really. The central idea was to fix the amount of tax that the zamindars had to pay the government permanently, like forever. It was never, ever supposed to go up.
And the logic behind the British plan seemed pretty sound, at least on paper. Step 1, fix the tax. Easy enough. Step 2, let the zamindars collect the rent. And they have to pass on about 90% of it to the company. But step 3, now this was the clever part, or so they thought. Any profit the zamindars made above that fixed tax, they got to keep. The idea was, hey, this will encourage them to invest in the land, make it more productive, and everyone wins. Yeah, sounded good. But, well, you can probably guess what's coming. The reality was a whole different story. This is where we get to the really oppressive outcome of this supposedly brilliant solution. Yeah, the whole plan just completely backfired. That whole incentive to invest, it just didn't work. Why go through the trouble of digging wells or figuring out better farming methods when there was a much, much easier way to make a profit? All they had to do was raise the rent on the peasants, and these peasants were now, legally speaking, just tenants with no security on the very land their families had worked for generations. And check out this quote from a government report at the time. This is from 1878. It really hits at the core of the problem. It says, they do nothing to improve their land because they fear they can be evicted from their land at any time. And it makes perfect sense, right? Why would you pour your sweat and money into improving a piece of land if the landlord could just show up tomorrow, kick you out, or double your rent? And this just created a total disaster, a whole cascade of awful consequences. Suddenly, every peasant is now just a tenant. Rents went through the roof, way higher than the actual tax being paid. The threat of eviction was constant, and of course, nobody was investing in making the farms better. The system was so brutal, it even made things unstable for the zamindars themselves. If they couldn't make that high, fixed payment to the company, they'd get booted out and replaced at an auction. So the permanent settlement was a bust. And ironically, the permanent part of it was the biggest problem for the British. This failure forced them to go back to the drawing board and try something totally different. And that's what led to the Riot-Wari experiment. The irony is just incredible, isn't it? The one thing they thought was so clever, fixing the tax forever, became their biggest problem. See, as the economy grew and more land was farmed, the zamindars were making a killing. Their incomes were soaring. But the company? Their tax revenue was stuck, locked in. So what did they do? They decided they needed more money, which meant they needed a whole new system. And this new system was called the Ryat-Wari system. The big idea this time, cut out the middleman. The government decided it was going to bypass the zamindars altogether and collect taxes straight from the individual farmers, who were called ryots. And look, on the surface, this sounds kind of good, right? Maybe even a little progressive. Get rid of the powerful, exploitative middleman. The British really thought that if they just dealt directly with the farmers, they could turn them into these successful, enterprising landowners. But if you've been paying attention, you know where this is going. Once again, the reality on the ground was a complete disaster. It just trapped farmers in a brand new and in some ways even more vicious cycle of debt and exploitation. Here's why it was pretty much doomed from the start. The government set the tax rate impossibly high, just unbelievably high. So high that to even have a prayer of paying it, many of these riots, the very farmers they were supposed to be empowering, had to turn around and rent out their land to even poor tenant farmers. So in another spectacular twist of irony, the system that was designed to get rid of middlemen ended up creating a whole new class of them. And the level of exploitation here was just staggering. Get this, a tenant farmer would pay his riot landlord anywhere from 3 to 7 times more in rent than what that riot was paying the government and taxes. We're talking about a markup of 300 to 700%. The profit was insane, and every single penny of it was being squeezed out of the absolute poorest people on the land. Then, something happening halfway around the world made a bad situation catastrophic. In 1861, the American Civil War kicks off. Suddenly, British factories desperately need cotton, and they turn to India. Prices for Indian cotton go through the roof. So what do Indian farmers do? They take out massive loans from moneylenders to plant as much cotton as they can. But then, in 1865, the American War ends. Demand for Indian cotton completely collapses, prices crash, and millions of farmers are left trapped in a debt they could never, ever hope to repay. And as if all that economic pressure wasn't enough, it was piled on with social exploitation. A practice known as vaidi became widespread. This was basically forced unpaid labor. Peasants were forced to go work on the private lands of their landlords for free. It was just one more layer of misery on top of the impossible rents and the crushing debt. So you add it all up, the insane taxes, the spiraling debt, the forced labor, it all led to a predictable and absolutely terrible outcome: massive famines and eventually resistance. This was the real human cost. The legacy these systems left behind was just devastating. We're talking widespread, inescapable debt for generations of farmers. Families lost lands they'd held for centuries to moneylenders. It led to terrible, recurring famines. It forced millions of people to leave their homes and become indentured laborers overseas. And, finally, it lit the spark for organized peasant movements to rise up and fight back. So in the end, these systems, which were so cleverly designed to generate wealth for the British East India Company, ended up creating unimaginable poverty and instability for millions of people. And it really leaves you with a heavy question to think about when a system that's supposed to create progress or wealth actually just creates widespread poverty. Who is really paying the price?